Wife fights for marriage equality. Brian Sanford sat with his hands on the steering wheel and groaned. It was enough to waste a precious Sunday on a 90-minute drive to his in-laws' house without another fight. But as soon as Becky strapped their 1-year-old daughter into the infant seat in the back seat and then settled herself into the passenger seat, things started to go downhill. Brian waited until his wife had fastened her seatbelt and started the engine. "Didn't you hear me?" Becky asked. "I heard you." "Then why aren't you answering?" "Because there's no answer that will satisfy you." Brian pulled out of their small driveway onto the street and then pulled onto the main road leading out of town. Becky watched him through the windshield, shaking her head. "I'm not asking for satisfaction," she said. "I just want to understand why I never get behind the wheel. You drive all the time, only when it's just me and Tara. And what was that message to her? That both men and women can drive? Yeah, but when we're together, it's always you. Come on, Brian, why are you so intimidated by a woman behind the wheel? It's like this. Is your masculinity really that fragile?" "Well, if the shoe fits." Brian checked his mirror. Tara was biting her fist and staring out the window with big eyes. Through the rear window, a car could be seen behind them. Brian flicked on his signal light and pulled up to the bus stop. "You can't park here," Becky said. "I don't park, I'm stopping." Brian unbuckled his seatbelt, and the buckle flew aside. He turned to Becky. "Okay," he said. "You drive the car." "Are you sure?" Becky said. "We don't want your pride to fall off, do we?" "I'm sure." Brian got out of the car. Becky unbuckled her seatbelt and moved into the driver's seat while Brian walked around the car. She was just about to buckle her seatbelt when the back door opened and Brian sat down next to Tara. "What are you doing?" Becky asked, getting in the car. "You can't sit there." "Why?" "Brian, I'm not driving with you in the back seat. I'm your wife, not your mother." "Oh, come on. Is your femininity so fragile that you can't see a man sitting with your kids?" "Brian!" Brian tickled Tara's belly and then leaned forward into the gap between the two front seats. When he spoke, he lowered his voice. "Becky, you wanted the driver's seat," he said. "Well, now you have it. But that doesn't mean I have to sit in the passenger seat." "I sit in the passenger seat all the time." "Oh, so you felt humiliated and now you want to humiliate me?" "No!" "Well then, I'll stay here with our daughter and you can drive." Brian looked around. "And you'd better get going. There's a bus coming for us." Brian sat back, smiling, and buckled his rear seatbelt. Becky put the turn signal on and brought the car onto the road. The 90-minute drive passed in complete silence, unless you counted the radio. Tara dozed off in the baby seat and Brian soon followed suit, leaning his head against the rear passenger window. Becky, meanwhile, sat in the driver's seat, her eyes on the road, her hands on the steering wheel, so nervous that she had a headache by the time they reached her parents' house. Becky's mother immediately took her to the guest room to lie down while Brian dealt with everything about Tara. Brian joined his father-in-law for a cup of tea while Tara sat and played with the toys her grandparents had kept especially for her. After a while, Becky's mother joined them and suggested a walk in the park. Brian retrieved Tara's folded stroller from the trunk of the car, but after setting it down, his mother-in-law suggested he stay in the house. "We'll be fine with Tara," she said. "Just be alone with Becky." "I think she needs to be alone with me." "No, she doesn't." Becky's mother squeezed his hand and left to get ready for her walk. Watching the elderly couple take his mumbling little girl away, pointing fingers here and there, Brian marveled at how things had changed. Becky's parents used to hate leaving their daughter alone with him. Now they did it all the time. Brian wondered what Becky had told them, especially her mother. Almost the entire house was carpeted, so Brian left his shoes at the front door and silently walked up the stairs. He stood in front of the closed guest room door and tapped it softly with the knuckle of his middle finger. "Fuck off," sighed Brian. There were two kinds of back off with Becky. The first meant, leave me alone, and the second was, I'm mad at you, and I want you to stay here so I can show you how mad I am." Brian knew it was the second kind of leave me alone, but it angered him that Becky expected him to know the difference, so he stood silently at the door and pretended not to understand what she wanted. "Brian!" It was a scream, Brian thought, regular as clockwork. Whoever came up with the idea that women were unpredictable had never been married to one. He counted to 3, then turned the knob and entered. Becky lay fully dressed on the made-up double bed, the curtains closed, white flannel covering her eyes and forehead. She lifted the flannel slightly to look at the man as he entered and quietly closed the door. She looked unhappy and annoyed, and Brian had to hold back a sigh of satisfaction. When Becky got her way, she prided herself on making her victory over him as unpleasant as possible. Judging by the look on her face, he was definitely succeeding with the driving. Becky watched him from a slit under the flannel, and Brian got the feeling that she knew it too. "Why didn't you come in?" she asked. "You told me to back off." As soon as he said it, he realized he'd gone too far. Becky's facial expression went from anguish to contempt, and she lowered the flannel over her eyes again. "Back off," she said quietly. It was the first kind of bugger off. It was unmistakable. Brian suddenly felt ashamed and sat down on the bed. "I'm sorry," he said. "That was unnecessary." Becky lay on her back, unmoving, silent. Then her shoulders shook, her mouth pulled downward, and she began to cry. Brian lay on the bed beside her, and the moment she felt his arms enclose her in a hug, her crying turned to sobs. Brian lay on his back, wrapping his arms around her and whispering, I'm sorry," in her ear. Wet hair stuck to her forehead from the flannel. Brian pulled it away and kissed the cool skin. As he wrapped his arms around his wife and stroked her back, the emotional storm seemed to pass. Becky laid her head on the soft spot between his chest and shoulder and let out a long, deep sigh. "Oh, Brian," she said, "why do you have to be such a jerk? Why do you have to be so controlling? I'm not controlling. I just want you to fulfill your promise. When did I ever promise to sit in the passenger seat in the car?" Becky let out a frustrated groan, as if Brian was deliberately missing the point. She placed her hand on the other side of his chest, spread her fingers apart as if retrieving a memory. "When you asked me to marry you," Becky said, "I made it clear that I didn't want to be the little woman of the house. I wanted to be taken seriously, as an equal partner." "You think I don't take you seriously?" "Brian, all I've done all year is take care of a baby. Yes, our daughter, it's very important. Don't do it, Brian. Just don't do it." Becky got up and sat down away from her husband. Brian sat down himself and stared at her in confusion. Becky felt the flannel in her hand and pressed it against her neck. She looked at the expression on Brian's face and shook her head. "Don't look at me like that," she said. "We both know how much you love that I'm a housewife and cook all these meals. You keep telling me what a wonderful mother I am and trying to keep me in my place. That's not true. Yes, of course you'll deny it, but I'm warning you, Brian, it won't work. As soon as Tara is old enough to go to the nursery, I'm going to start my career too. And I expect you to keep your promise to do your share of woman's work." Becky squeezed the flannel, then frowned. She held it out to her husband. "Would you do me a favor and run this under a cold faucet?" she said. "Sure," Brian replied, taking the flannel. "And look, I think that—" "Brian, please, I've got a splitting headache. Am I not entitled to some peace and quiet without having to listen to you all the time?" Brian stared at his wife, fighting the temptation to hurl the flannel at the wall. There were times when he couldn't take his eyes off Becky, and there were times when he could barely stand the sight of her. This was one of the latter moments. Without a word, he rose from the bed and headed for the door. Becky lay back on the bed in the same position she had been in when he walked in. "Brian," she said as he stood in the doorway. "Yeah? Don't forget to wring it out properly. It should be moist, not dripping." "Yes, darling." and back off sarcastically. "Of course, darling." Becky flinched, as if he'd caused her real pain, and covered her eyes with her forearm. Brian looked at her with an expression of disapproval, then left the room and quietly closed the door. When Becky's parents returned with Tara, the whole family sat down at the oval dining room table for tea with scones and homemade jam. Tara, of course, was acting adorable. Becky had seen how much her parents enjoyed being caring grandparents and knew she should be happy about it, but she wasn't. She wanted to scream, "What about me? I'm married to an asshole and you don't even notice." Besides, Brian seemed to be genuinely enjoying what was going on. He was making such a fuss about losing his precious Sunday visiting her parents, and now he was having fun himself. It was so unfair. When evening came and it was time to head home, Becky had a plan to give her husband, who was having an impossibly fun time, some well-deserved revenge. She wanted her parents to see the real Brian, and she knew exactly what needed to be done. Her parents stood by the car, her mother holding Tara in her arms while Brian stowed the folded stroller back in the trunk. Becky pulled the car key out of her pocket and slipped it onto her middle finger. "By the way," she turned to Brian, "I'll drive us home." "Sure," Brian replied, shrugging his shoulders. Becky stared at him. He said it with such nonchalance as if he'd been letting her drive the whole time. Brian opened the back door, and Becky's mother handed Tara to him. Becky couldn't calm down. "And you're sitting in the passenger seat," she said. "Well, I won't fit in the trunk, will I?" Brian said. Her parents laughed. Brian disappeared into the car to buckle Tara into the child's seat, and Becky realized she was running the risk of being crazy. Worse, she still had a headache and didn't feel like driving at all, but now she couldn't get out of it without looking like an idiot. The last words of farewell were said, seatbelts fastened, and Becky turned on the engine and headlights. She drove the car out of the village where her parents lived, onto the winding country roads that would eventually lead to the freeway and home. Tara fell asleep a few minutes after leaving the village, and Brian pushed his seat back so there was more legroom. It was dark in the car, but Becky could see in her peripheral vision her husband folding his arms and getting comfortable for a nap. "Typical man," she said. "You sleep and I do all the work." "You wanted to drive," Brian said. "Yes, but that doesn't mean I want to do it alone. What am I supposed to do?" "You can keep me company." Becky heard her husband's quiet but very sincere sigh. It was like a blow to the senses, and tears came to her eyes. When she spoke, a sob could be heard in her throat. "Thank you, Brian," she said. "It's nice to know that my husband considers talking to me a chore." "Talking to you is fine. Being nice to you, on the other hand, is a chore." "Oh, being nice to me is a chore, is it?" "Not so loud, Becky." Becky tried to lower her voice and yell at the same time. "Go away!" she hissed. "You're the routine." "I know," Brian said, "but at least I'm honest about it." "No, you're not honest about it." "Okay, fine. You're right, I'm wrong. I recognize all the arguments. Anything else?" Becky wanted to rip the steering wheel out of its mount. It was one of Brian's favorite tricks in arguments, and she hated it. It was like playing chess with a man who accidentally gives up his king in the middle of a game. A tear streamed down her face from the previous upset, but this time she was more angry than hurt. "You're a coward, Brian." "No, I'm a pragmatist." "How so?" "Because I realize there's no point in talking to someone who isn't interested in what I have to say." "That's not true." "Okay, fine. You're right, I'm wrong. I admit everything." "Brian, stop it." Brian sat with his jaw clenched, staring into the darkness of the road. They had passed a sign showing that it was 2 miles to the freeway, which meant it was still about an hour's drive home. Could he sit in uncomfortable silence for an hour? Of course he could. Brian knew that if he wanted to, he could take Becky out of her mental equilibrium. He'd done it before in the guest room. But why should he do it? Why should he? If the situation was reversed and he was the one in a bad mood, Becky would just say, stop it," over and over again. When Becky was pregnant, everyone kept saying how hard it was to be a parent, but it was infinitely easier for Brian than being a husband. The signs on the freeway approach glittered in the darkness. Becky drove through a complicated traffic circle, looping among cars and trucks that were trying to find the right lanes. Then they pulled onto a freeway with fairly heavy traffic, and Becky took the second lane at speed. From that point on, the way home was practically straight. Becky cleared her throat. "Are you just going to sit there like that?" she said. "That's kind of what a passenger does." Becky said it in her mom's voice. "Does Daddy's ego still hurt?" Brian held back the urge to cuss her out. He took a deep breath and waited for his subconscious to come up with something worse. "You know, to be honest, I like driving," he said. "Sitting in the driver's seat with my wife next to me and the baby in the back seat. Yeah, it makes me feel like a man. And I honestly don't know what to do with the fact that I'm married to a woman whose main source of happiness is robbing me of that feeling. It's awful. What happened to 'it's not true'? Well, it's not true. Try it again, Becky, and this time with more conviction in your voice." Becky opened and closed her mouth, looking at the road. She wanted to scream, but couldn't because Tara was behind her. Brian took advantage of the moment. "You always say you want equality," he said, "but when you get it, it never makes you happy. The only time I see the light of true happiness in your eyes is when something important is taken away from me." Becky flicked her turn signal and moved into the first lane at the same time. It was an unexpected maneuver, and the car she clipped roared to life. Brian grabbed the handle above the door. "What are you doing?" he shouted. "You've won, Brian. You can't stop on the freeway." "Don't be ridiculous," Becky said. "That's what the hard shoulder is for. It's for breakdowns and emergencies." "Well, it's for both." Becky pulled the car onto the hard shoulder and slowed to a stop. She turned on her emergency lights, flash, and unbuckled her seatbelt, the buckle flying off to the side. Cars whizzed past on the highway at an alarming speed, but she paid no attention to them. Instead, Becky stared at Brian, and the red light of the flashers reflected in her eyes. "You want to be a man?" she scoffed. "Fine. You can be a man." Becky reached for the door latch. Brian lunged forward to grab her arm, but was thrown back by the seatbelt, and a flailing hand struck his wife in the face. Becky cried out, grabbing her eyes with both hands, and Brian unbuckled his seatbelt and pulled her as far away from the car door as he could. "Let go, asshole!" Becky screamed. "No!" Brian said, pinning her against the seat. "Get off of me! Not until you promise not to get out of the car. Me, I won't drive. Fine. But I'll get out of the car and go around it myself. You're not getting out of the car on the freeway." As if to emphasize this, a construction truck rumbled past, the wind making the car shudder. Brian pressed his forehead against Becky's head. "You're an insufferable woman," he said, "but I'll never forgive myself if anything happens to you." Becky stopped struggling. Cars still whizzed by, but there was a peace about them. Brian felt Becky shift under his arms. When she spoke, the harshness in her voice disappeared. "It's okay, Brian," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." Brian loosened his grip and pulled back. Becky looked up at him. Even in the faint light coming from the dashboard, he could make out the darkening bruise on her cheekbone near his wife's eye socket. "Oh, God, Becky," he said. "I didn't mean to." "It was an accident," Becky said, running her fingertips over his lips. "I know it was an accident. Even so, Brian, are you afraid I'll resent you?" "Well, that's what we do, isn't it?" Brian looked Becky in the eye. Becky looked back. But for the first time that day, or maybe in days, there was no judgment in either of their gazes. And softly, silently, like a change of light, the man and woman remembered that they loved each other. Brian suddenly felt the urge to kiss Becky on the lips. Becky wanted to get home as soon as possible so they could get naked and make love. Both looked slightly embarrassed at this realization. Brian then looked at Becky and laughed. "Oh my God, look at that," he said. Becky turned her head. Tara was still sound asleep, sprawled out on her seat, with her mouth wide open and drool connecting the edge of her mouth to her shoulder. Her small breasts rose and fell smoothly, a picture of unconsciousness. Becky pulled a tissue from her pocket and gently wiped the little girl's mouth. "How cute," Becky murmured. "Yeah," Brian said. "Are you sure you don't want to drive?" "I'm sure." "Because I really don't." "Brian, it's okay. I need a break." "Good." Brian kissed his wife on the forehead, then opened the car door with the side facing the metal barrier and the field. The trip down the freeway was quiet, but this time it wasn't discomforting. Becky dozed off in the passenger seat and Brian just drove, part thinking about the road, part reflecting on the day's events. Becky woke up just as Brian was pulling off the freeway. They'd be home in 15 minutes, less if they were lucky with the traffic lights. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Sure," Brian replied. "Does it really bother you when I drive?" "That depends." "On what?" "If you really enjoy driving and you think I'm taking away from your enjoyment, then sure, I'm happy to share it with you. But if you're doing it to prove your feminist position, then yes, that bothers me." "Don't you believe in equality?" "Again, it depends on the circumstances," Brian said. "I believe in equal rights under the law. I believe in equality of opportunity. But equality in driving? Give me a break." "Yes, but isn't that a reflection of equality in our marriage?" Brian frowned, pondering the question. He slowed the car down at a traffic circle, but the traffic was heavy, and he passed it without stopping. "Look, when you say you want something," Brian said, "I always try to figure out, does Becky really want it? Or is she repeating what feminists say about what she should want?" "What are you talking about?" "Well, look what you said today about me wanting you to be a housewife. Do you really believe that I'm secretly plotting to oppress you because I like being the breadwinner?" "What do you mean, believe it?" "Brian, I never said that. You said, and I quote, 'The reason you keep telling me what a great mom I am is to try to keep me in my place,' unquote." Becky sat with her arms folded and her teeth clenched as they drove down a familiar road lined with local stores and restaurants. She hated Brian's ability to memorize everything she said down to the smallest detail. Her own memory for detail wasn't that good, and it was terribly unfair to be at such a disadvantage. "Fine," she hissed. "What's your point?" "My point is this," Brian replied. "If you're not happy with being a housewife and a full-time mother, we'll work something out. We can split the responsibilities 50-50 or 60-40, whatever we feel more comfortable with. The same goes for driving and cooking dinner and anything else you want to talk about. But I'm married to you, not your girlfriends or a bunch of feminists on the internet. I only care about what works for us, not what they think, and if I ever smell their bullshit, I'll make sure you smell it too." "How about the fact that you're full of garbage? Then call me out on it. I promise you, Becky, I will never apply standards to you that I don't apply to myself." "But I don't want you to apply your standards to me. I want to apply my own standards to myself." "But what is equality if not that we have to conform to each other?" "Well, I don't want that kind of equality." Brian was thoughtful as he turned the car onto their street. He and Becky would never come to a consensus on this issue. The very fact that she believed in the existence of different kinds of equality said it all. For Brian, equality was a singular and unchanging concept. Thing A was equal to Thing B according to some agreed-upon unit of measurement. For Becky, on the other hand, equality was about feelings, fairness, and feminism. But as Brian slowed down in front of their house and carefully steered the car onto the concrete patch that served as the driveway, he realized he didn't care that much. Okay, he and his wife had a disagreement. So what? No marriage is perfect, and he was perfectly content to let things stay the same. Becky wasn't so optimistic. Turning around to check on the sleeping baby, Becky felt herself tense up without knowing why. It was embarrassing and frustrating for her. Brian had spent the entire previous hour driving while she had slept most of the time, so theoretically, he should be more tense than she was. But it was quite clear from his compliant demeanor that he was perfectly fine and only she was tense. It was so unfair. Brian turned off the headlights and then the engine. There was a moment of silence at the end of the drive as the man and woman sat in the dark, each with their own thoughts. Then Brian turned to Becky and gave her a wide, carefree smile. "Well then," he said, "we're home." The end. Subscribe to my channel. Thank you.